Good afternoon and a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Roxana Markoch, the David Ekman Senior Curator and Acting Chief Curator of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art, and it is my pleasure to introduce this forum on contemporary photography together with my colleague and co-organizer, Oluremi Onabanjo, Associate Curator in the Department of Photography. This convening brings together a formidable group of artists and writers who will share with us their perspectives on the photograph as document, a concept with a rich tradition in image history, which invites not only the probing of varying forms of visual representation, but also the decentering of the document, or what a document is, in light of the idea that photography itself is not fixed, but unstoppably developmental and temporally morphing, as Katja Silverman would say, that it has a liquid intelligence informing collective political action, that it is, in other words, humanity's way of revealing itself to us, that it visualizes the act of seeing as consciousness raising. Organized on the occasion of Remi's forthcoming exhibition, New Photography 2023, Kelani Abass, Akinbode Akinbiyi, Yagazie Emezi, Amanda Iheme, Abraham Oghobase, Karl Ohiri, Logo Oluwamuyiwa, which will open next month. This forum offers an intellective preface to that exhibition's scholarly reassessment of complex visions of modern and contemporary art, contributing to a global conversation about the role images play in societal narratives. And with this succinct introduction, I would like to invite Remi to join me in opening the session with a few words about the 2023 iteration of New Photography. Remi?
Many thanks, Roxana, and particularly so for the invitation to co-organize this session of the Contemporary Forum on Photography together. I'm grateful to all of the participants working across different practical and conceptual contexts, time zones and continents, who said yes to staking out their position on the vexed relationship of the image to the documentary mode. So if we could pull up my first slide. Thank you. So as Roxana mentioned, this session is organized on the occasion of New Photography, which will open at MoMA on the 28th of May and run through September 16th this year, featuring the work of 7 phenomenal image makers and thinkers, which I've had the pleasure to work with over the last year and a half, with the assistance of Samuel Allen, MRC Fellow, and Caitlin Buhar, Newhall Curatorial Fellow here in the Department of Photography at MoMA. Taking the West African port city of Lagos as its curatorial ground, New Photography 2023 recognizes that photographic images are no longer primarily a means of recording surroundings, but that pictures have become central to how experiences are made and shared. Foregrounding the sociality of the image, the exhibition interrogates forms of visual representation dominated by the global north in order to make space for more nuanced forms of perception and encounter. In the process of organizing New Photography 2023, I've become interested in what it looks like for curatorial and artistic thinking to exceed the spatial contexts of the gallery, to perhaps parochialize the white box, and to spill outwards into the actual sites of critical and creative thought that inform the making of photographic art. So this first took shape in the form of the 3-day portfolio review and critical workshop that took place at Angels and Muse in Lagos, with the participation of all of the artists featured in this exhibition, alongside an emerging generation of new Lagos-based photographers from 31st of October through the 2nd of November last year, in collaboration with the Nlele Institute, an autonomous Pan-African organization of image makers. So as a kind of continuation of those generative conversations across the continent, across different contexts, in person here to being online with you all, this session of the Forum of Contemporary Photography is orchestrated as a space to expose the kinds of connections that feed into the making of photographic artworks and the spaces that house them. It's an occasion to come together in order to challenge what is often taken for granted in pictures, right? The surface, the text, and moved into their undercurrents, speaking into the silent spaces where the subtext lives, ever concentrated, unresolved, and unfolding. I feel the collective of thinkers we have with us today allow us to do just that, and so I'm excited to look long, think differently, and continue to learn from them here today. Now, before we jump in, next slide, please. I'd like to note that this session is dedicated to the memory of Emma Louise Malongo Wolukawanambwa. Before she passed earlier this year on the 2nd of January, Emma had accepted our invitation to present at this session. While she is not with us here today, she remains in our minds and our hearts. With the blessing of her brother, Stanley Wolukawanambwa, I dedicate this session to her memory and ask that you join me wherever you are in observing the following moments of silence for her. Thank you. And with that, I pass it back to you, Roxana, to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Remy. It is my great pleasure to welcome writer and curator Omar Barada, director of Dar Al Mamoun, a library and artist residency in Marrakesh. His work focuses on the politics of translation and intergenerational transmission. Omar has organized public programs at the Centre Georges Pompidou, hosted shows on French National Radio, and ran Tangiers International Book Salon. His own poetry was included in the University of California Book of North African Literature, and his translations include books by Jalal Toufik, Jean Retalac, and Stanley Cavell. Omar is also the author of the poetry collection Clonal Hum, and has recently edited The Africans, a book on migration and racial politics in Morocco, and La Septième Porte, a posthumously published history of Moroccan cinema by Ahmed Bouanani. Omar's writing was included in numerous anthologies such as Poetic Justice, an anthology of contemporary Moroccan poetry, and in magazines, among them Frieze, Bidoun, and Asymptote. Omar also teaches at the Cooper Union, where together with artist Leslie Hewitt, he co-organizes the IDS lecture series. And today he will present on the photographer's discourse, translation, and cultural transmission. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you, Roxana and Remy, for the invitation. I'm still moved by the dedication to Emma Wolukawanambwa. Thank you for that, Remy. And gratitude to everybody at MoMA for making this gathering possible. Today's prompt, Decentering the Document, made me want to revisit some works by Tunisian artist Nidal Shamekh and some thoughts I had developed in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring. What is an insurrection, after all, if not a radical decentering of the document? An insurrection proclaims the fall of an order, but not quite the rise of another. It wagers on uncertainty. What should artists do in a time of revolt? Can artworks uphold the apparent disorder of freedom dreams? 12 years ago, during the Tunisian Revolution, Nidal Shamekh made a series of drawings titled, "What Do Martyrs Dream Of?" Note the present tense. The artist pledges to be the martyr's ally in the present, to testify for them beyond their passing, to bear witness to the visual memory of the defeated. This aesthetic of montage and image transfer brings together distinct historical layers into a single plane, an indeterminate horizon of appearance, a kind of expanded present, the present of persistence. Of this, the last drawing in the Martyrs series offers a symbol, the milk thistle, a plant that stubbornly grows in abandoned places all over Tunisia. In the same drawing, at a time when new revolutionary songs are blooming, the artist chooses to foreground an old poem that pays homage to Mohamed Darbeji, an anti-colonial fighter who was shot by the French army in 1924. Here, the same single line is repeated 18 times, like an undying echo. These works are meditations on the traces left by events, on what remains of past struggles. What remains is an image as undeniable as it is elusive, like a dream when it recedes. These works do not simply depict contemporary struggles, they probe the visual unconscious of Tunisian modernity, its fraught revolutions, its repressed revenants. For instance, those of the 1980s bread riots. Here, there are no documents. They have been absent for too long. They've been absented, like the prisoners' bodies. You found one? It can no longer speak, only repeat its simple song. The testimony lies not in me, but in your care. An archival image, burned, documents its own destruction. Photographs are exhibited backwards, showing only their captions. Get close to the wall and look sideways. You may discern an uncertain image, as though reflected in a distorting mirror, a sort of vampire in reverse. You can see the reflection, while the object itself is withdrawn. In this withdrawal, there emerges a resistance of memory, an alternative mode of appearance. We are the children of a dream too old and too heavy to die in silence. During the bread riots, poet and activist Fadel Sassi was shot in the heart. Visual evidence from the insurrection was disappeared, but a few snapshots survived. Out of these, Nidal Shamikh made a triptych of drawings, 3 poses of Fadel Sassi. In the 1970s, when John Berger's father died, instead of taking photographs, he made drawings of the corpse in its coffin. It was his way of recording a unique moment, the intensity of seeing for the last time, he says. For Berger, a photograph stops time, while a drawing encompasses time. A photograph documents an encounter between event and photographer. A drawing questions the fallacies of an event's appearance. In its slowness of execution, it contains the experience of looking. After the drawings, Shamikh made a second triptych, this one screen printed, using glue and burnt bread ashes as agents for revealing and fixing the image. The picture is born from the literal remains of its subject, the daily sustenance that austerity measures push further out of reach. Bread dust produces a very grainy result. The developing agent is also an obstruction grid, a blurring instrument. By delaying visibility, it reinserts a latency within the image. It reopens its potentials of appearance. The image is a dream waiting to be dreamed. Next slide, please. Nidal experiments with methods of revealing the image. Next slide. Nidal experiments with methods of revealing the image as an attempt to disform the moment of arrest, to unfold the duration compressed inside the photograph, to devolve some time back to memory, to extract from a buried past a possible future, to resurrect an insurrection. After all, one of the main asks of the Arab Spring too was bread. Aish, hurriya, karama insaniya, the Egyptian protesters cried. After all, the Tunisian uprising was literally ignited by the self-immolation of a man, Mohammed Bouazizi. Nidal Shamikh burns bread, not to document an event, but to honor the martyr's dreams, to turn sacrifice into testimony. Artworks are the ashes of revolution.
Thank you. Thank you, Omar, so much for this richly and very poetic and richly perspective presentation on Nidal Shamikh and the visual unconscious of Tunisian modernity. This is such a powerful, presentation on the African experience under colonialism and also its revolutions. And it is now with great pleasure that I would like to introduce Sandrine Collard, curator at large, Canal Centre Pompidou, and assistant professor of art history, Rutgers University, New York. An international lecturer and a historian of modern and contemporary African arts and photography, with a focus on Central Africa, Sandrine's scholarly interest brings together post-colonialism in the arts, vernacular photography, and the globalization of the contemporary art scene. In 2021-22, she was a Getty ACLS Fellow for her book, Recaptioning Congo, African Stories and Colonial Pictures, a volume about the history of photography in the colonial Congo, linked to an exhibition at the Photo Museum Antwerp. Her publication was selected among the best art books of 2022 by New York Times art critic Jason Farago. Sandrine has also written and lectured on post-war colonial and African photography, examining the intersection of two usually antagonistic impulses, imperial propaganda and Black modern self-imaging. Sandrine, we look so much forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Roxana, and thank you, Remy, for this wonderful invitation. Can you hear me properly? Yes, wonderful. Recapturing Congo is an exhibition that I curated from more than a decade-long research about photography in the colonial Congo between 1885 and 1960. It was presented at the Photography Museum of Antwerp, Belgium, until last January. Throughout the show, a double perspective presented a deconstruction of the long hegemony of Belgian colonial propaganda alongside African-made images of their colonial reality. As announced by the title, Recaptioning gives particular attention to the reappraisal of colonial photography's documentary claim and its affixing of meaning through the written word, and equally to the recuperation and centering of African competing visions and voices about colonial history. Next slide. The show follows the chronological arch of imperial occupation starting 1885. Just over a decade later, a foundational photographic event will dramatically mark the trajectory of the medium in the country and will place it in the arena of the document. Next slide. The violence perpetrated against African workers in the context of forced labor came to be known as the Congolese atrocities, and physically mutilated people became the subjects of an unprecedented photographic campaign. On top of their circulation through lantern slide lectures, the newly invented portable Kodak and half-tone process will multiply these atrocity images like never before. The international scandal that followed caused the downfall of King Leopold II regime in the Congo and the long-lasting anxiety of colonial authorities about their image. Next slide. Starting the interwar period, the photographic construction of a specifically Belgian-looking home-like Congo will contribute to assuage this anxiety and legitimize colonial power, as well as attract colonial candidates from the metropole. The most popular colonial illustrated magazine, L'Illustration Congolaise, was published between 1924 and 1940. In its images and captions, it represented the Congo on its way to transform into the metropole. Here, a celebration of the very popular Belgian children's feast, Saint-Nicolas, portraying the Congo as a place suitable for families. Next slide. Here, the bottom picture describes the African landscape as so similar to Belgium that the caption anticipated that viewers would confuse both landscapes. And this was a repeated strategy over the 13 years of the publication of the magazine. Next slide. On the other hand, the Congolese self-commissioned portraits were regularly diverted from this personal use to be reprinted in the magazine. These captions often derided their desire for self-representation. Next slide. It is this double consciousness, famously coined by W.E.B. Du Bois, that the see-through photographs printed on veils were expressing in the exhibition's installation design. Next slide, please. Antoine Freitas, an Angola-born photographer working his whole life in the Congo, lifted the veil on the subject that posed in his studio in Leopoldville, but also in his travels throughout the country when he offered his services of itinerant photographer. Next slide. And here is one of the beautiful portraits that he made in the Kasai province in the Congo. Next slide, please. Yet colonial and indigenous realms were never sealed off, and the construction of African subjectivities often developed at the intersection of contradictory impulses, imperial imagining on one side, and sovereign self-representation, Black self-representation on the other. It was not rare that portraits commissioned by Congolese customers were then willfully sent for publication in colonial magazines, such as this one, Nos Images, Our Images. The journal sought to cajole their African readership into acceptance of colonial images as their own by mixing official and personal images. Next slide, please. This seduction was largely orchestrated by the colonial authorities with the photographic service in Fort Congo starting in the 1940s. It developed a systematic and copyright-free coverage of the colony in order to avoid any exogenous image making. Faced with the threat of anti-colonialism and with the rise of independence movements in Africa, the authorities, Belgian Congo authorities, particularly targeted the new Congolese middle class. And it strove to represent it as so close to Belgian middle class that any political claims of emancipation would be anathema. Next slide. Yet, on the other side of the segregated Leopoldville was a different reality, and this veil shows the road separating the European and indigenous quarter, the so-called Cité Noire. Next slide. The Black part of town was the operating field of Jean de Barras, where he documented radically different views of Black lives under colonialism, usually modalities of its transgressions. Here, transgressions of the curfew and of female gender role, as de Barras' female models were all the antithesis of the unassuming mother and housewife. Next slide. Here, the Bills, dropouts converted to a life of crime and whose inspiration was the American cowboy Buffalo Bill. Next slide. Here, bodybuilders affirming their beauty and physical force. All these models repudiated the models of the middle-class Christian family, and de Barras were transgressions paving the way to independence. Next slide. The show Recaptioning Congo concluded with photo diptychs first presented at the 2019 Lubumbashi Biennale. Next slide. They showed a group of colonial images coupled with family images recaptioned after interviews conducted in the city of Lubumbashi and collecting the inhabitants' memories and reactions. And here is how these diptychs are reprinted in the book companion of the exhibition. Next slide. In Lubumbashi, on the day of the opening of the exhibition, young people massively showed up. And they really show that the next generations in Africa are ready for the restitution not only of objects, but also of the debates about their colonial past. Thank you.
Many thanks, dear Sandrine, for that searing presentation and deft deconstruction of Recaptioning Congo. I'd now like to beckon forth the impeccable poet and essayist Momtaza Mehri, who will be using her time to share a thread that appears in a forthcoming book project concerned with the fraught nationalisms carved out by anti-colonial independence movements, the mythology of the Golden Age, and the attendant chronic nostalgia enveloping these historical moments. Engaging the vintage photographic portrait in and beyond Somali family albums, Momtaza will contend with how diasporic subjectivity is informed by this inheritance. Welcome, Momtaza.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you for being here, and to MoMA and the conveners for inviting me. So I'll just begin with the first slide. That's not technically the first slide. But I want to start with a quote from Svetlana Boym's The Future of Nostalgia. And it goes as follows. The nostalgic is looking for a spiritual addressee. Encountering silence, he looks for memorable signs, desperately misreading them. So when I was approached to take part in this forum, I was already thinking of nostalgia as a kind of metadata, this implausible but undeniable currency. And I'm still a bit obsessed with the instability of a preserved inherited memory. How do you capture a shaky image, an unstable image, an apparitional image? And what can we make of the visual feedback loops between post-colonial nation and its transnational diasporas? So I want to dwell in the visual squalor of nostalgia to try and inject some criticality into a space of deep feeling and phantom pain. Nostalgia has its practitioners and its purveyors as well as its symbols. And I want to consider the role of Somali women as, to borrow a phrase from one of Kaha Muhammad Aden's short stories, the emotive cable behind a lot of this instrumentalized work. So the first image you see here is just a classic ethnographic image, Donna Somala, Somali woman, and it's taken in 1911, and it was probably displayed at some sort of exhibition. So the ethnographic gaze, it doesn't wildly interest me, but I'm intrigued by how we as Somalis recover and re-engage with the ethnographic gaze, whether it's in what we find in these photos, these illustrations, sketches, paintings, postcards, in how we sort of connect with this colonial or outsider framing, especially with how these images are circulated in the diaspora, and they end up having these very rich digital afterlives. Younger generations develop this sort of yearning through these images, this sort of return to trad affectations, and they're invested in the bare substance of these images. So mythic, pre-urbanized, pastoralist beginnings, the stern, white-robed nomad. And then there's obviously the misty-eyed recollections of the actual post-independence era and what remains, the photographic documents of that remain from that era. And you have like Vintage Somalia, which was a popular Tumblr site, but also a sensibility. You have the stamps and the memorabilia, the Francobolli that depicts Mogadishu and these sort of staged scenes and portraits that is circulated in these e-commerce sites and eBay and all sorts of different places. Facebook groups where Italian users mourn the long lost colonial days and share their family photos from the Horn of Africa. And also forums where Somalis do the same, lamenting this sort of demise of the old ways. So I'm really interested in how all these dynamics take on the gloss of nostalgia. Next slide. To quote the writer Christina Ali Farah, how do individuals who have lost all their points of reference put down roots again? And to that, I add my own questions. What restorative images do they lean and rely on? Is nostalgia an aesthetics of despair? And if that's the case, then how do Somali women become custodians of nostalgia? Next slide. So these portraits you're seeing were taken by the publisher A. Parodi in the 1930s, whose name appeared on postcards printed by Fotocelleri of Turin, as well as period publications of that time. So Parodi may have been linked to the Regio Laboratorio of Mogadishu, the Royal Laboratory of Mogadishu, and its chief photographer, Carlo Pedrini, who held that position from 1926 to 1932. So contemporary researchers and photographers like Abdi Roble, they've really sort of gone into how the many ways in which these photographs and these images were used for propagandistic purposes, even though they were characterized and marketed as sort of true images. Pedrini himself, he died very young in Somalia, and he was eulogized in the Italian press as the photographer who brought Africa to the Italians. So again, you have this logic of dissemination, propagation, but also in very unsettling but deeply revealing ways, the sort of aspiration towards this coherent image, this coherent past, can be seen in these photos circulating in the diaspora. as sort of vintage, benign, postcardish kind of peeks into a disappeared past, but also like the bare bones with which we can kindle our nostalgia. Next slide. So I think in many ways you see through these dynamics, the diasporic or the sentimental backward glance swallowing and repurposing the ethnographic. And here I turn to the researcher and curator Abira Hussein when she asks, how do we respond to ethnographic images? What entanglements do they create with the imagination of our past and the places where the empire was orchestrated? Next slide. I also wanted to include this image from the post-independence era, and it was taken by a cultural anthropologist, an American called Herbert S. Lewis, and he took a lot of photos that sort of, they're in this sort of vein where they capture the febrile post-independence energy and also just in almost this sort of backing noise or background hum of that sort of political activity, as well as the adornments of scientific socialism. So under the rule of the Supreme Revolutionary Council at that time. So you have that a lot in these images, plastered in the walls, the background, the banners, the street signs. That one, for example, it says, "لن نرحم أعداء الشعب," we will not have mercy on the enemies of the people. Next slide. This is another image, an Associated Press image taken in 1978 at a military training camp. So again, here you have women providing both the literal and the visual reinforcements to this sort of idealized, securitized stride into modernity. And obviously images of marching women, camo-clad women, they're asserting themselves at a time or a period of intensifying uncertainty, the Ogaden War of that period. And I think what's crazy to me about this photo is, again, the digital afterlife that it's now found, because it's actually a photo that is passed around in the right-wing digital sphere as, you know, part of a hoax where they claim that, you know, obviously it's a lie, but that the woman in the photo is a young Ilhan Omar, the politician. So again, I'm thinking of the coalescing cross-historical reactionary impulses that put these images and the women featured in them to use. Next slide. And here we have like the lush visual repositories of the golden age. I mean, bananas are sort of a great example to kind of use here because of the monopoly and sort of they supported agricultural development, but also leaned on a system that was utilized, an infrastructure that was utilized during the Italian colonial period and its plantation systems. But here you have, again, this monopolized image of the country also being exported. So as a brand, the golden era proliferates. If we have a look at the next slide, you'll see how women are pushed to the front again in service. So they welcome dignitaries, they sing for politicians, they pose for official tourist guides, they present artisanal culture at fairs and festivals, like here, as you can see at the Milan Trade Fair. They're sent abroad as cultural representatives and ambassadors, and they're sort of like plucked from the street and into the arena of the nationalist imagination. And if you have a look at the next slide, you'll see the kind of imagery. So picking grapefruit in Afgoya, and it's, again, it all takes on that hue and then is repurposed for these nostalgic purposes. If we have a look at the next slide, I just wanted to include an example of a sort of a photography studio in Mogadishu in the 1980s, and just contrast it with some of the specialty studios that you may be familiar with, those in West Africa, Rashid Mehdi's in Atbara, Mama Kassé in Dakar, but also these studios were quite family run and scattered. And again, you know, you can see just as some information, the posters on the wall and the photos taken are all actually of quite popular figures in Mogadishu nightlife and entertainment at that time. Next slide. And I wanted to sort of also include an example of the sort of portraiture of the period. So here I've used an image of Mariam Omar Ali, who is a Somali archivist. And again, you have that sort of the signifiers of this kind of portraiture, which have become also retrospectively fossilized. So the garish backdrops, the flowers, the plants, the vibrancy, the vitality, the sort of aspirational air. I would appreciatively call this a kind of freshy aesthetic, a sort of dislocated surrealism. And I think that's been really admired and reappropriated by contemporary diasporic artists. Next slide. And yeah, I kind of wanted to also show, you know, the way in which the personal archives become dipped into, particularly family photos and or images pulled from the family album, and how these images become sort of excavations or private excavations that then become or contribute to a collectivized nostalgia. So this idea of portraiture as a heirloom, and you have here, you know, this project. Healing Through Archives that was in collaboration with Autograph and Numbi Arts. And it really explored those interlocking sort of and the interplaying dynamics between what's private and what's public, and how we sort of broadcast nostalgia and participate in it communally. So with the next slide, I wanted to also look at the work of Mustafa Saeed, an artist like him. He's a Hargeisa-based photographer and founder of Funkene, a youth-led art platform and gallery. And this is an image from a project that he worked on, the Anarchist Citizenship. And I wanted to end with this image because it's indicative of connectivity between the homeland and the diaspora, the breakneck sort of rate of development, and also a youthful population that is seeking to represent itself. And I think I'm a lot more energized by this sort of playful, cheeky intentionality or approach towards nostalgia, because it's arising from a generation of Somali artists and photographers who aren't really interested in these tired symbologies or these delusive pasts, or even staging or fossilizing women in these battles between modernity and tradition. They're sort of widening the acceptable circle of confusion, as a photographer might say. And they're wrestling with the past and present, not as they want it to be, but as it actually is.
Thank you, Momtaza. That was brilliant. I mean, I'm so invigorated by the idea of nostalgia exploded, like recircuited and made anew in many ways. And I know I'm among the many who cannot wait to read the book. So thank you so much for giving us a taste today. So pivoting now from the image still to the image moving, I'd like to introduce the doyenne of Black Brazilian film, Janaína Oliveira, who has a heart and a brain that expands across continents and fields. Janaína will share with us a few glimpses on how we might reconceive the documentary capacity of the image through the concept of opacity. And she has something special for us in relation to O Rei do Cor, the King of Color, Walter Firmo. So with much gratitude and excitement, Janaína, I pass the Zoom room over to you.
My sound. Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here this afternoon. Thank you so much, Roxana and Remy, for this invitation. As Remy said, I'm not properly a photography person, let's say. I'm more like kind of film person. So it was really challenging to be here today. For me, a kind of displacement, but it's about displacement, so let's go. I started with this quote of Edward Glissant: we demand the right of opacity, because opacity was a theme and the curatorial prompt of the 66th edition of the Flight Film Seminar, which I was the programmer. So I'll use Glissant ideas of opacity to not only inform the program, but to create what I usually call epistemological displacements. I'm talking about film culture, and this is the main thing about my work. I would like to say that I'm always interested in creating those kind of displacements, not only about film canon, but also thinking about epistemology in a broader sense. Next slide, please. So this is the curatorial statement. I'm not reading it. I forgot to say the time. I'm not reading it. But what I'm going to tell you is just a little bit about what's the seminar. The seminar was created by the Robert Flight, known filmmaker, Francis Flight, around 70 years ago almost. And the main thing is just like you get into the program only knowing about the theme and the curatorial statement, and you became aware of the artist as the days goes by. Usually it happens for a week, but in my shift, I got a pandemic on the way, so we had to make it online, so it became 10 days. Next slide, please. This is the second part of the curatorial statement. Opacity, I use, as you can read it there, but also it's available on the website of the seminar. It was not only the proposition, the provocation to think about how we relate to images without reducing them to the traditional logic of transparency that dominates the Western thought. So how we go and watch films and think and live the cinematic experience, and without reducing them, assuming then their singularities. So it was the team, but also the way how I programmed everything. So the 10 days and 18 programs, I had basically the same statement coming back as a spiral movement. Part of the program is online on the Criterion channel. You can see it. Next slide, please. So those are the artists, or just for you to have an idea of with whom I was working. When I was invited to be here, I was thinking how I could create a dialogue. Since I'm a film programmer and scholar, and I'm really interested in investigating not only the works, but also how programmers work, I brought today a little glimpse about the exhibition, the current exhibition that is going on now in Brazil. Next slide, please. It's an exhibition about Walter Firmo with his work. It's called No Verbo do Silêncio, a síntese do grito, something like Walter Firmo in the verb of silence, the synthesis of the scream. Oh, speak you well for me, sorry. So and it was interesting when I was thinking about what to bring here. I saw myself investigating different exhibitions program, and I recently was in New York with Remy, and I have this amazing moment with her walking through Ming Smith exhibition, and I thought that that could be something that I could bring here to think about how Oghobase can help us navigate this world of decentering documents. But let's stay with Walter Firmo. So this is the exhibition, the São Paulo moment, because it started in São Paulo, then went to Rio, and now it's in Brasilia. So next, I'm gonna just go through the slides because there are some moments of the exhibition. Next slide, please. So Walter Firmo, he's from Rio. He's 86 now. He started taking pictures when he was a kid, when his father gave him a camera. So he always says that he dreamed photographing since he was a kid. He started working photojournalism in 1955 and never stopped. He worked for several newspapers and magazines and built a long-lasting career recognized with several awards. Known, as Remy reminded us, as a master of color. Firmo is the author of memorable portraits. Next slide, please. You can see some of them on the yellow wall. Firmo is the author of memorable portraits of Brazilian music icons as Pixinguinha, Dona Ivone Lara, Cartola, Paulinho da Viola, Jamelão, and many others. And also he's well known as by his work with popular images of popular festivals that he recorded throughout Brazil, from the Carnival in Rio de Janeiro in the Southeast, to the Bumba Meu Boi in Maranhão, and to the Congada in Minas Gerais, and many others. So since 2018, his work is being stored by the Instituto Moreira Salles, that they have around 155,000 photos of Firmo made through several decades. Next slide, please. So, and Walter Firmo also, beyond the colors and focusing Afro-Brazilian culture, I think what mesmerizes me about his work is how he portrays everyday life, affection, family, friends, and also reenacting sometimes classic images of Western culture. Next slide, please. So what I was impressed during this exhibition and thinking about the work of the curators, Janaína Damasceno and Sérgio Bughi, Sérgio, that is the head of the Moreira Salles Institute Department of Photography, and Janaína, that's a professor, anthropologist, and photography curators, how it was the selection of he has this huge amount of work. And it was the selection and the displacements of the work creating a kind of movement and a kind of suspension, literally, between dream and reality. Also, I have to say that we are talking about displacing of decentering documents, and the traditional way of thinking about photography in photojournalism at black and white and registering instantaneous moments was something very crucial in Walter Firmo's work, because he got through his life a lot of criticism about the colors and about staging the portraits and photographs, and that he asked the curators to have a black and white room on this exhibition just to show the world at his 86, I have to remind, that he knows how to photograph in black and white. Next slide, please. So I'll jump to the photography. I choose to talk a little bit here. So next is the next one. So yes, for me, when it comes to connecting to the notion of opacity, Firmo's photographs breaks with the traditional pattern of journalism, documentary image, not only by the vibrant colors, but also open room for the construction of some fabulation, of critical fabulation, to quote Saidiya Hartman. He's, as I mentioned before, he's known by frequently staging the scenes, as the one we are seeing here, inviting us somehow to a kind of displacement of what we expect when we see some aspects of Black culture in Brazil. So this is a boy in Cerro. It's a city inside Minas Gerais. That's a state inside Brazil. So there's no sea around. And he's dressed as a sailor because this is a part of cultural festivity that's called Marujada. That's a kind of reenactment coming from Portugal, but also mixed with Afro-Brazilian cultures. So it's a kind of reenactment of a kind of, how to say, precision, people playing and drums, and all dressed like a kind of sailor uniform. And he asks these boys to look to the horizon and places him in front of these banana trees. And when asked what he was intended to do, he said that he was giving him a boat and a horizon. And I think this is a kind of, for me, when I was walking with Janaína Damasceno through his exhibition here in Rio, that was one of the moments when you can see, when you can experience this possibility of displacement and being asked as an audience to look in a different way of what you should expect, for example, of a Brazilian popular festivity. So what mesmerizes me in Burgui and Damasceno creative proposition, it's not how they explore Firmo's colors, but also the affective dimensions of his work in presenting everyday life of Black people. Dream and reality coexist in suspension, as some images was actually suspended in the room. Next slide, please. I think yes. One thing about also striking about this exhibition actually here in Rio is that Walter Firmo, that's in the picture with Janaína Damasceno here in Rio and the others in Brasilia 2 days ago, that he was there almost every day giving people rounds. So I think this moment for me show also something about what is to be a photographer, a Black photographer in the Brazilian context, and to have the possibility of have his work celebrated in life. Damasceno says that more than a memory of a nation, Firmo's work is part of a photography archive of the Black diaspora. I could totally agree with her. But also for me, the way film decenters what we traditionally expect of an image as a document. And his very singular way of using the colors, kind of explosion of feelings and emotions comes in every moment when you look at his work. The encounter with this selection make possible somehow to experience the lines of opacity that I think can guarantee not only the right to see something very complex and hard for non-white hegemonic audiences and people in general, but to exist with the images and ask us for other ways of understanding what document is or can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Janaina, so much for your beautiful, enticing talk on the reconception of the documentary, the poetics of relation and the right to opacity. It is my pleasure to introduce Antoine Bird, College Fellow in Art History, Northwestern University, and Associate Curator of Photography and Media at the Art Institute of Chicago. Antoine specializes in modern and contemporary art of Africa and the African diaspora, with a particular focus on histories of photography, sound, urbanism, and popular culture. The recipient of the award for curatorial excellence from the Arts Council of the African Studies Association in 2017, Antoine's research has been supported by 2 Mellon Fellowships and 1 Fulbright. Antoine co-curated the 10th Bamako Encounters Biennial of African Photography in 2015, as well as the 2nd Lagos Biennial of Contemporary Art in 2019. He recently co-edited The People Shall Govern, Medu Art Ensemble and the Anti-Apartheid 1979-1985, and is currently at work on a major exhibition of Pan-Africanism slated to open at the Art Institute of Chicago next year. So we can't wait for this exhibition, Antoine, and also for your presentation.
Thank you. I think it's unmute. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. A big thank you to Remy and Roxana for inviting me to participate in this forum. Since 2019, I've been studying art and cultural production that reflect the wayward trajectories of Pan-Africanist thought during the long 20th century. This has been in preparation for, as Roxana signaled, Project a Black Planet, the art and culture of Pan-Africa, an exhibition I've been curating with Elvira Denganiose, Adam Getachew, and Matthew Wachowski, which opens next year. I mentioned this project to provide some context for my engagement with the prompts of today's forum. The prompts ask that we consider how photographic documents can be implicated within systems of transnational and international relation, and how this registers through the formal, poetic, and socio-political work of photographs. And so I'd like to reflect on these prompts by discussing the photographic record of an institution that I have been studying for a while, and which I regard as a Pan-African space in both its outlook and programming. Next slide, please. This space, which may be familiar to some of you, is the National African Memorial Bookstore in Harlem. The image here documents the facade of that storied institution as it appeared on 7th Avenue in 1964. The bookstore was founded in the 1930s by Louis Michaud, a self-educated Garveyite and civil rights activist known across Harlem as the Professor. My initial interest in the image had to do with the network of loudspeakers that appear at the top of the building, just above the sign designating the bookstore as the house of common sense and home of proper propaganda. Indeed, my initial engagement with the picture in my dissertation framed it as an instance of how photographs visually demonstrate the uses of loudspeaker technologies to shape the life worlds of African and diasporic subjects during the 1960s. But today I want to think about how photographic documents and the practice of documentation can generate insight about the workings of Pan-African spaces generally, but especially as it relates to questions of time, space, and scale. Next slide, please. I first learned of the bookstore through the catalog that accompanied the infamous Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Met in 1969. As historians Deborah Willis and Susan Cain have noted, in the context of this exhibition, documentary photographs of Harlem took priority over actual artworks, and so problematically presented Harlem as an ethnographic curiosity. But when we remove the photograph from that context, the image as a document enables us to understand how vernacular spaces registered forms of Pan-African engagement. In the absence of an existing institution, the bookstore closed in 1974, the photograph becomes a tool of reconstruction, a tool of uncovering hidden temporalities. The photograph shown here at the right thrusts us before overlapping planes of hand-painted portraits of prominent diasporic political figures, such as Marcus Garvey, as well as African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta. The shop's transnational portrait cycle of African chiefs of state, is the language the sign uses, evokes at once a male-dominated history of indigenous leadership in modern post-colonial statecraft during the 1960s, and also recalls the patriarchal biases that pervaded Black politics during that time. The dense and frenetic energy of the exterior alludes to the bookstore's comprehensive scope and multi-purpose orientation. At its height, the store carried more than 250,000 pieces of printed matter and ephemera that variously indexed and circulated Black consciousness and Pan-Africanist thought. As the sign just above the bookstore's entrance announces, Michaud dubbed the shop's exterior Harlem Square, thereby designating the space as a site for social encounters and the exchange of verbal discourse, as suggested by the two subjects seated curbside. Meanwhile, a large horizontal banner below the portraits reads, "Repatriation Headquarters," a reference to Marcus Garvey's 1920s Back to Africa movement. The sign calls attention to the history of Black separatist movements, which go as far back as the 19th century, though the sign also tends toward the future. Notice the use of the gerund, recruiting, which, though the sign is a relic from an earlier period in the bookstore's history, seeing it in this 1964 photograph still frames the continent as both a real destination and utopic site of mass return. The store's promised inventory of world history and the signage's informal census of 2 billion African and non-white peoples orients the viewer toward a global scale and emphasizes the magnitude of diasporic dispersal. In short, although the photograph documents a specific temporal and spatial encounter between the photographer and the facade of the National African Memorial Bookstore, the content of the exterior, with its dizzying agglomeration of sounds and visuals, material forms and textual references, constantly gestures toward multiple temporalities, analogizing the disjunctive sense of time and space that is constitutive of African diasporic modernity. Next slide, please. And here I just bring in an image by Cartier-Bresson, who's another photographer who documented the space. And over the years, I've been amassing a corpus of images of the space, which includes also images by Kwame Brathwaite and other photographers. Next slide, please. On August 1st, 1974, the Black American photographer Anthony Barboza made more than a dozen photographs documenting the bookstore's interior, which was by this point situated on West 125th Street on the corner of 7th Avenue. Mr. Barboza, who was then in his early 30s, told me that he went to the shop looking for photographs by African and African-American photographers for his personal archives. Unable to find any, he opted to make these pictures instead. One image Mr. Barboza made is particularly instructive to understanding that institution's mission and aesthetic. Shown here, the black and white photograph situates us, next slide, please. Shown here, the black and white photograph situates us before an airless enclosure with a range of books and portraits of prominent Black cultural and political figures. The image prompts us to imagine what it might feel like to stand within this landmark institution, to take in the smells of incense and old books, the sounds of Miriam Makeba, or recorded speeches by the likes of Nnamdi Azikiwe and Eric Williams. Although unbeknownst to Mr. Barbosa at the time, he was one of the last photographers to document the space, for the shop closed after 42 years of activity. The shop closed permanently just months after this picture was taken. The document becomes a memorial. Indeed, there's something elegiac about the photograph. Aside from our knowledge of the shop's then imminent closure, the outsized honorific portrait of Malcolm X, who had been murdered a decade earlier, registers as commemorative. Elegiac also because of the shrine-like assemblage of things found below Malcolm's portrait. The most conspicuous being, next slide, please. The most conspicuous being the tricolor red, black, and green flags just behind the central sculpture. The central placement of the flag within Barbosa's composition underscores the centrality of Pan-Africanist ideology to this institution's ambition of educating the entire Black race. Indeed, the sheer range of textual and visual references contained within the single picture suggests nothing if not deep passages between Africa and its diaspora. Figurative wood carvings evocative of Senufu sculptural traditions, a broadside featuring a portrait of Sekou Touré, and way up above, near the tubes of fluorescent lighting, a widely circulated portrait of Marcus Garvey to the left of a portrait of Mary McLeod Bethune. Among the books on display, canonical texts such as Sam Greenlee's 1969 classic fiction novel about Black radical insurgency, The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which was first published in Europe because American publishers refused to publish it. Another classic, Mary Baraka's 1967 Tales, a collection of surrealist stories that meditate on jazz, racial disorder, and revolution. Next slide, please. In focusing on various documentary images of the National African Memorial Bookstore, I want to suggest that these images serve not only as documents of the space's exterior and interior, but they also function as maps of sorts. Maps that recall for me Edward Glissant's Table of Diaspora, which appeared in the appendix of his 1989 book, Caribbean Discourse. Like Glissant's diagram, the photographic documents of the bookstore, through their visual and textual references, points us to the complex and messy histories of Black migration, aesthetic and literary influence, political agitation and statecraft, violence and mourning, activities that have influenced or has been influenced by the development and practice of that enduring utopia ideal we call Pan-Africanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine, for your insightful photographic and bibliophilic presentation. What an eye-opener on Pan-Africanist thought, the image as a tool of historic reconstruction, the document as an elegiac memorial, and the National Memorial African Bookstore. I wish we could just put it back in place. What an amazing space. It is now my honor to welcome Leslie Wilson, Associate Director for Academic Engagement and Research at the Art Institute of Chicago. International in scope, her research, teaching, and curatorial endeavors focus on the global history of photography, the arts of Africa and the African diaspora, modern and contemporary American art, and museum studies. From 2017 to 2021, she was Assistant Professor of Art History at Purchase College, SUNY. Her current and forthcoming projects include Not All Realisms, Photography, Africa, and the Long 1960s at the University of Chicago Smart Museum of Art, where she was a curatorial fellow from 2019 to 2021, and David Goldblatt, No Ulterior Motive at the Art Institute of Chicago. Leslie has contributed to publications including Manual, Foam Magazine, African Arts, and CAA reviews. Leslie, welcome, and the platform is yours.
All right, thank you all so much. Just getting myself adjusted. Thank you to Roxana and Remy for the kind invitation to contribute to today's forum and to do so with the spirit of Dearest Amabola Kawanamba and Head and Heart. I'll be sharing a few stories connected to works on view in an exhibition that I began working on when I was a curatorial fellow at the Smart Museum of Art at the University of Chicago, titled Not All Realisms, Photography, Africa in the Long 1960s. Delayed a few times amidst the pandemic, but now currently on view. And my thanks so much to the team there, especially my research assistants, Daisy Coates, Serene Lee, and Mariah Bender. Not All Realisms also includes a mini library inside of the show, which features texts written by many of the people presenting here today. And I am so indebted to your exciting scholarship and terrific new work emerging across disciplines in the field. It's really incredible. Next slide, please. The exhibition, Not All Realisms, which you see some views of here, focuses on matters of photography, circulation, and flow. It centers practices of reading and reading against photographs, and the culmination of photographs in text, photographs in drawings, photographs in the traces of where they've been, rectos and versos, photographs that mutate, the photographic undead, the zombie, photographs that come back again and again. And those photographs emerge out of an era of sweeping change bound up in a chain of events long preceding the neat demarcations of a watershed decade, the bookends of 1960 and 1970, with ramifications that reach potently into our present. For those long 60s, I was helped by thinking of James Meyer's proposition of the long 60s as quote unquote an ideological notion against other constructions of the 60s as decadal, firmly delimited by calendar time, or oriented around 68 as apex or denouement. Meyer characterizes the long 60s as quote, perpetually deferred, forever unfulfilled, unquote. Next slide, please. And so out of that context, I'll start first with a dialogue between two magazines that are seen in the middle of this display, and then a few thoughts about reading with and against photographs, and on continuing to believe in photography's capacity to document, even when the medium seems like a very bad bet. Next slide, please. A page near the beginning of the January 1956 issue of South Africa's Drum magazine, which you see in close-up on the right, features the following cordial request from the staff of the Dakar-based Bingo magazine, and I quote at length, "Drum, we send you fraternal greetings. Our magazine Bingo, which is for French-speaking Africans, published a picture of the Drum staff recently, and in exchange, we wish you would publish this photograph of Mademoiselle Yolande Trama. She was posing with Bingo for the photographer Musa Sako." In response to Bingo's appeal, Drum complied and included Sako's image of Trama, the kind of photograph that might have easily made a Drum cover. Drum's editor at the time, Sylvester Stein, followed up the photograph's inclusion with an inquiry of his own. "Pleasure, Monsieur Bingo," Stein wrote. "Now, let's say we exchange the whole Drum staff for Mademoiselle Yolande." Next slide, please. Beyond demonstrating their casual sexism, the exchange between these two magazines, one Anglophone and headquartered in South Africa, one Francophone and based in Senegal, suggests the far-reaching ambitions and success of both publications to cultivate audiences far beyond their immediate environs. The photograph of Trama, made on the beach at Cannes, France, first appeared in a September 1955 issue of Bingo in a spread featuring happy vacationing beauties. Next slide, please. Not only was Trama holding up an issue of Bingo, but in a photograph to her right, one of Drum's popular cover girls, Priscilla Ntumkulu, lays poolside at the recently constructed Huddleston Bath in Soweto's Orlando West. Ntumkulu flips through the pages of Drum while a row of young men ogle her. In each instance, from France to South Africa, the magazines present the young women as both the ideal promoters and consumers of these publications. And although originating from very different contexts and having very distinct characteristics, these two magazines convey their mutual admiration and interconnectivity through this playful exchange. So-called bathing beauties notwithstanding, les amis de Bingo, the friends of Bingo, range broadly, with individuals, young couples, and members of the military featured regularly. Next slide, please. In stark contrast to the staging of ideal readers of photo-driven magazines as part of a continent creating new models of solidarity and liberation, as seen in Bingo and Drum through the 50s into the 60s. In 1965, the South African government's Bantu Affairs Commission staged a magazine reader of their own. In the booklet, Domestic Servants in Urban Areas, a photograph shows a Black woman holding open an issue of the magazine Gesenet, or House Companion, a popular Afrikaans language general interest magazine targeted at white female audiences. Still wearing her uniform, she's identified by the following caption, quote, "A domestic servant relaxes in approved quarters on her employer's premises, unquote. But while she holds the magazine open, she directs her gaze not at the publication, but toward a sideboard topped by a radio, flowers, and dishware. She appears to be listening while performing the act of reading. And if that is indeed what's happening here, the scene hints at a disturbance in the booklet's emphasis on decorum, rules, and satisfaction. It is tempting then to read against the booklet's instructions on approved relations between white employers and Black employees, to attend to the world of the woman's own imagination and personal desire. Here we might think with Tina Camp's definition of fugitivity as, quote, a practice of refusing the terms of negation and dispossession, unquote. Here we might try to listen to her listening and refusal. And still maybe this woman is reading Khois Hanut. Maybe she finds something she likes. But then again, maybe she's reading against Khois Hanut. Maybe she sighs in approval and disapproval as she flips through the pages. Maybe all or none of this is true. In March 2020, ahead of entering lockdown, I was on a research trip to Johannesburg, where I spent time with the South African photographer Ernest Cole's papers and the Historical Papers Research Archive at Wits University. Cole's exhaustive research in support of his book, House of Bondage, published in 1967, is evident in his extensive notes and his collection of booklets, magazines, newspapers, and more. Indeed, Cole mentions in House of Bondage's chapter titled The Cheap Servant, a booklet called Your Bantu Servant and You, which from his description there was very similar to the booklet that you see here. Next slide, please. Cole annotated many such booklets, including one issued by the Pretoria City Council's Department of Non-European Affairs in 1965, titled Bantu Residential Areas in Pretoria. Next to the local government's captions accompanying photographs touting the quality of services such as transport and healthcare, the provision of housing, and conditions for jobs, Cole writes his own comments refuting the council's claims. Following a caption about the work of Black clerks employed in municipal offices, Cole adds the phrase, who earn next to nothing. On the opposite page, a color photograph of a house with a tidy garden accompanies a caption about the homes that wealthier Black residents were building. However, Cole adds, quote, but they can't own the ground on which the house is built, unquote. Throughout, Cole amends the council's claims to speak to dispossession and exploitation. That work of refutation demonstrates Cole's thinking toward constructing a narrative of his own, photographic and textual, about apartheid's realities, and his belief that he could make something of the photographic document. Next slide, please. That annotated booklet is not present in the exhibition, but it was at the forefront of my mind as I went into lockdown and contemplated a project in which reaching to collections beyond the Chicago area might not be possible given the pandemic's endurance. And as I dug further into libraries and archives with the long 1960s in mind, I continued thinking about Cole's notes, his archive, and the book that he made. Next slide, please. And so I thought I'd end by thinking about Cole's way of reading while jumping back into the 1950s to a booklet produced by the British colonial government in 1955, in the last years at the helm of the country that is now Ghana. The authors of The Problem Children of the Gold Coast, published in 1955, directed readers' attention to the youth, quote, who haunt the cinemas, get into trouble at school, wander about the streets and frequent bars and dance halls, unquote. And it starts from the place of the cinema as a particularly troublesome sight. The supposed threat seems to begin with the children's capacity to imagine and to be together, and the hiddenness of that imagining and togetherness in the darkness of a theater. While the booklet aimed to use photographs to illustrate delinquency, the images throughout it are replete with possibility and fun. Young boys in matching uniforms stand together looking at movie posters for the deliciously titled The Vanishing Outpost and To the Victor. And I like to imagine them writing their own endings to the caption outside the cinema, to make the document speak to their truths, to make the problem someone else's. Thank you.
Wow, Leslie, thank you so much. Thank you for the gift that is Not All Realisms. I mean, between that like bonkers correspondence between Drum and Bingo and Ernest Cole's annotations, what an incisive intertextual meditation on the sociality of the image. I could sit in the long 60s with you forever. It's now my pleasure to introduce Rasha Salti, an intellectual force of a film and visual arts curator and writer who gathers artists and ideas with unending criticality and creativity. I had the pleasure to work with Rasha alongside Cali Garrido and Gabe Beckhurst as members of the curatorial team for the 8th Triennale of Photography Hamburg, assembled by the great Cleo Puo. Today, Rasha will think aloud with us in relation to the work of Raed Yassin, one of the artists featured in the Triennial's core exhibition at the Daitohallen, Currency Beyond Capture. Over to you, dear Rasha.
Thank you, Remy. It's a pleasure and an honor to be among this wonderful assembly. Thank you, Roxana, Megan, and the whole MoMA team. Okay, so this is in the company of Silver Spectres, was a series of photographs that we exhibited that were part of the triennial that we all joyously curated together. The series first saw the light in 2021. It consists of photographs of approximately the same size. They were spray painted by the artists in pigments of the primary color palette, almost. The layer of paint is just thick enough to reveal silhouettes and general forms. Next slide, please. Raed Yassin is probably one of the most curious contemporary artists that I know. His practice is so multidisciplinary, proliferating, sprawling, it is unclassifiable. He was born in Beirut. He graduated from the theater department of the Institute of Fine Arts in Beirut in 2003. He is an actor, stage performer, visual artist, and musician. His practice includes video, photography, sculpture, performance, computer programming, taxidermy, embroidery, cooking, experimental music composition, improvisation, and turntable mixing. He was a resident at the De Atelier in Amsterdam, at the Delfina Foundation in London, and the Academie der Kunst der Welt in Cologne. He is a recipient of the Abraj Group Prize in 2012. As a musician, he's one of the organizers of the Irtijal Festival for Experimental Music in Beirut. He has released several albums as a solo artist and is part of groups known such as the A Trio and Raed. In 2009, he founded his own record label with a fellow friend. It's called An-Nihaya, which is Arabic for the end. He currently lives in Berlin. There are thematic threads and obsessions that run through his various engagements and projects, and some are the outcome of his lived experience growing up in Lebanon during the Civil War. Yassin lost his father when he was a child and lost his mother when he was a young adult. The family experienced social and economic demotion, had to move several times to escape shelling and being caught in the line of fire. Memorialization and memory, writing and projecting the self, narrating and iconicizing collective experience, countering loss, and self-fictionalizing revelry, repair, and the infinite restorative potential of art are these themes that run through his practice. Next slide. Yassin was reared in pop culture, box office, Egyptian cinema of the 1980s, Kung Fu films, Lebanese television series, and Japanese anime series translated to Arabic, just to give you a sense of his universe. For years, Raed Yassin collected photographs and family albums at flea markets in Beirut, Cairo, and eventually Berlin. Other people's memories, stories, histories, other people's fleeting appearances, captured, recorded, but also discarded by their owners, sold by strangers to other strangers. Photographs outlive their authors, their subjects, the social, political, and psychoaffective contexts in which they are produced. What happens to a wedding photo when those who appear in it have passed on, and those to whom it has been bequeathed don't care to safekeep it? Next slide. Stripped of its specific context and individual narrative, the photograph becomes a document with clues and secrets, a haunted house of ghosts and specters, as well as a screen of projections. In other words, whatever the onlooker's eyes have been trained to see, decipher, detect, and excavate is what she or he will extract or understand from a photograph. In recent years, other people's discarded photographs, or more euphemistically, found photographs, have been used by artists, writers, and academics as a generative primary source to resurrect silenced or marginalized his or her stories, for weaving creative and restorative fabulations that suture ruptured pasts, and for the production of critical knowledge that challenges established canons around disenfranchised communities. Next slide. In spraying paint over abandoned photographs of other people, Raed Yassin renders them opaque, almost invisible, a drastic and at some level violent gesture that obscures the photograph's potential to become a screen for the onlooker's projection, and that deters the researcher's ability to excavate clues and produce knowledge about the subjects and the social conditions manifest in it. The photographs become spectral, haunted. They also become what they are, traces of the lives of people whose stories are irrevocably locked within, memories no one will remember because their owners abandoned them. In today's reality of visual surfeit, of the tireless circulation of billions of photographs, obscuring photographs seems uncanny and almost, in some sense, a countercultural gesture. For Yassin, whose family photographs were lost, damaged, or destroyed during the Lebanese Civil War, the initial impulse to collect other people's family photographs was a way of compensating for his own traumatic loss. However, as his collection kept growing, it became a burden, and the number of persons inhabiting them seems to be metastasizing. What was to be done with these untold, uninvestigated stories? Was it his task to resurrect or imagine them? The color palette of the spray paint is not insignificant. For although some of the photographs were purchased in Berlin, the bulk originates from the quote-unquote global south. The palette intentionally references the chromatic scale of modernity, the Steil movement, the Bauhaus. At one level, the series insinuates how modernity and its technological savantery obscured the so-called global south. Yassin has been driven to recreate the past throughout his other projects and works. With this spectral series, he not only restores the image's opacity, but he also emancipates himself from the expectation, from the pressure to investigate, speculate, and imagine a past for himself and for others. In my own practice, I have dedicated years to excavating an unwritten past of wayward lives from and around other people's photographs of other people. And when I came across In the Company of Silver Spectres, although Raed Yassin's gesture was entirely contrary to what I had dedicated years of my life to, with love and patience, I felt the images were emancipated from my own researcher's gaze. Thank you. Short.
Short but phenomenal. Thank you so much, Rasha, for that poignant subversion of pictorial possibility. I'd now like to invite the inimitable Zoe Samudzi to present. An assistant professor at the Rhode Island School of Design, and in my mind, one of the most consistently rigorous thinkers of the political stakes of image production, circulation, and consumption, Zoe will share with us a strand of thinking that situates the status of the photographic document within the context of colonial violence. Thank you, Zoe. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Remy, for that introduction. And thank you so much to you and to Roxana for assembling us here and dedicating this space to Emma's incredible work and her legacy. I just want to share a little bit from an ongoing project, thinking about the kind of spatio-temporality extraction and of land politics across former settler colonial Southern Africa, and specifically in former Rhodesia, today now Zimbabwe. In this post-colonial reckoning with the materialities of colonial dispossession, which is to say enduring land questions and incomplete or unstated processes of land reform, it's crucial to consider and perhaps even reclassify landscape photography, the ontological, affective, and political function it serves in the past and in the present. If, following Joan Schwartz and James Ryan, the visual communication between the state and its geological and ecological findings and the public contributes to, quote, the development of a settler geographic imaginary, which is to say the means through which settlers are able to situate themselves in space and time, then it cannot be understated that these images dually serve a function in the colonial state's process of primitive accumulation. The circulation of these images persistently serves to force back the foggy horizon of the cartography of the unseen, thus enabling land to be assimilated into ongoing simultaneous processes of settlement and dispossession. So if we were to consider, for example, the arboreal life of the Mazoe Valley in then Southern Rhodesia, or then simply Rhodesia between 1965 and 1980, we might see rows and rows of citrus estates as above, or afforested regions of gum trees, eucalyptus trees, first planted by the Native Commissioner's Office in the valley in Southern Chiweshe. One region I'm considering in my work at the moment is in this part of the country marked by the settler British administration as agriculturally superior, as you can kind of see in the upper right-hand side of the map, and thus diversifiable land that could be used for a multiplicity of crops as well as animal husbandry. The British South Africa Company used the Mazoe Valley to grow oranges, and so the valley lends its name to a popular orange cordial, Mazoe Orange Crush. Within this area also existed land the British Southern Rhodesian government designated for Black natives, communal areas squeezed between commercial farming areas with Bindura and Matepa Tepa farms to the east, Concession Mvuri farms to the west, Centenary and Mount Darwin farms to the north, and Mazoe farms to the south. Next slide, please. And following the originary land dispossession and forced resettlement to reserves, the region is also where one of the many so-called protected villages or keeps, concentration camps created and policed by the Rhodesian military, where civilian populations were interned and separated from the liberation fighters, were located. This villagization, a military practice of concentrating scattered rural native populations, began in the mid-1970s, in the last years of the Independence War, when the fighters were making significant headway against the Rhodesian government. Some of the first keeps were created in Chiweshe through Operation Overload, which intended to push native insurgencies within the Chiweshe Tribal Land Trust south towards the then capital of Salisbury, now Harare. As part of Operation Overload, all of the nearly 50,000 people of the land trust were forcibly relocated to one of the keeps by the Rhodesian military and forced to build new homes from the materials salvaged from the old ones. One of those people was my mother, who was a teenager at the time. A consideration of land within the colonial archive then demands an application of imperial grammars to that land because of the transmuting conceptions of land through space and time and the definitional impositions that follow. While these imperial grammars do not displace the local and regional indigenous histories, tracing a visual genealogy of land in the imperial archive means reckoning with the endurance of imperial terms, which have structured an ongoing capitalist political economy. This imperial grammar also contains a conception of continental ecologies in which native, human, and non-human life worlds alike could be captured and enclosed. Even as the 21 protected villages were segregating structures, it is telling that the permitted spatiality of the keep so closely resembles the living quarters of employees that were working for the Southern Rhodesian Base Metals Corporation. And we'll see the barracks, those barracks in the next slide, please. We know that the conquest of Rhodesia came through the forcible consolidation of Matabele and Mashona peoples, and then the subsequent, fixing of regional territorial boundaries by the British South Africa Company's border making project in service of acquisitions of material wealth. Land was alienated from natives and reserved for settlers and settlement. In order to understand apartheid in all of its constituent parts, particularly racialized labor, one has to understand land. In order to understand the kinds of qualifications made about so-called post-apartheid and then the so-called post-colony, one must understand land through a multi-directional conception of time. In his show, Living with Ghosts, curator KJ Abudu considers a modernity, coloniality, decoloniality paradigm in which there is no rupture between epochs, and this is a conceptual frame not entirely unlike Bauman's conception of liquidity. Abudu writes, quote, centering the geographically dispersed, geologically expropriated, and epistemologically phantomized entity that is Africa, one arrives at the non-presentness of an accumulated present and the non-here-ness of an entangled here. In other words, a stubborn, uncanny, extra-ontological condition of ghostly non-being that Derrida aptly terms a hauntology. The so-called post-colony's non-linear temporality following Mbembe consists of, quote, multiple derays made up of discontinuities, reversals, inertias, and swings that overlay one another, interpenetrate one another, and envelop one another, an entanglement. One in which time is not serial, but an interlocking of presents, pasts, and futures that each retain their depths of other presents, pasts, and futures, each age bearing, altering, and maintaining the previous ones. This consideration of how every age is the aggregation of the ones preceding and an anticipation of the ones to follow collapses space-time and allows for the spatialization and attendance to the indigenous subjectivities therein, which is to say the ancestral, the spectral, and thus the material. If land, following artist Nolan Oswald Dennis, is something we do, a process, procedure, and a practice rather than a thing, then it follows, of course, that our historicizations of archival images of land ought to be conceived of as communities of phenomena rather than a momentary glimpse or capturing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you so much for this poignant presentation of photography and the legacies of settler colonial extraction, dispossession, and violence. It is a wonderful opportunity now to welcome René Moussaï, an established research-led curator, scholar, writer of photography and lens-based media with a special interest in African and Afro-diasporic Black feminist and queer visual arts practice, who recently also took on the role of artistic director at the Walter Collection. René was previously senior curator and head of curatorial and collection at Autograph, a London-based nonprofit space with a remit in photography and film addressing cultural identity, race, representation, and human rights, where she has worked for almost 2 decades advocating for diverse constituency of contemporary artists and commissioning and co-commissioning a range of artistic programs, including the critically acclaimed Black Chronicles, between 2014 and 2018. She was responsible for numerous exhibitions, including of works by Zanele Muholi, Ferg Boswell, and James Barner. Currently, she is at work on 2 publications, Eyes That Commit, Black Women and Non-Binary Photographers, a Visual Survey, which is forthcoming from Preston this fall, and Black Chronicles, Photography, Race and Difference in Victorian Britain, which we should expect from Autograph in 2024. Welcome, René.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you, Roxana and Remy, for organizing this forum. First slide, please. A visionary veteran Black lesbian photographer dons an orange prison jumpsuit and space helmet and turns the camera onto themselves. Oxygen, pressure, protection, compression, oppression, compassion, liberation and flight, voyage and triage, capture and confinement, embodiment and incarceration, freedom and fugitivity. An acute visual response to a pervasive atmosphere suffused with racial injustices, an atmosphere that makes it difficult and at times fatally impossible to breathe. In this climate, Centering their, our living and breathing, they create a photographic document imbued with futurity, with a beautiful, potent diasporic feasibility, a space of refuge and retreat, of sustained photographic responsibility, a space where all of the isms of 4 decades of practicing art as activism collide, converge, and commune, testament to a lifelong commitment to genderqueer visual politics, moving forward through Milky Ways of acute visibility. Next slide, please. To photograph oneself in an orange jumpsuit makes it difficult not to be seen, to be recognized, to be remembered. Here, Lola Flesh resolutely, restlessly, rigorously occupies their own center, imbuing its edges and its core with centrality and intent for all of us who have been for too long positioned, visual and otherwise, along designated peripheries, circumscribed temporalities, restricted spatialities, or fraught chronologies, for all of us whose bodies are deemed deviant, different, colored, othered. Next slide, please. Note 2, Mothering Blackness, Zanele Muholi. Next slide, please. A letter I wrote to Muholi in 2019 begins as follows. Dear Muholi, lately I have been infatuated, obsessed with the word, otherwise, with all that it holds and implies, discerning, relational. It suggests change and fecundity. It can be a promise or a threat, an opening, rebellious, conditional, or else. Reflecting on the ongoing body of self-portraits, I write again a year later. Each manifestation, each liberating and able disabling image in the series, each inscription, a depiction of a self in profound dialogue with countless others, posing critical questions about social and racial injustices, human rights, and the historical image archive, about beauty and contested representation, fueled by the inescapability of your arresting gaze, scrutinizing, disquieting, and empowering. Next slide, please. Inside galleries and across public sites of inscription, Sonyama Gonyama is all-encompassing. Amplification, activation, affirmation, reclamation. At the center, next slide, please, a manifestation of Bester, simultaneously defined and refined by the tools of her labor, her, their head, crowned with silver scouring pads. And this is what you tell me. How do we learn to look at ourselves, consume ourselves, reclaim how we want to be seen or looked at by the other? My mother, Bester Muholi, was a maid. She was a beautiful Zulu woman who never made it onto the cover of a magazine. Locked into 42 years of servitude, her lifelong prison was somebody else's kitchen. What if she had access to your garments? What if she imagined otherwise? And I respond in another letter, letter 4, entitled, Where Are They? Mothering Revolutions. Don't all revolutions fundamentally begin with our mothers and acts of mothering? With rituals of birthing, unearthing, caring and repairing, with imagining and inhabiting. Next slide, please. Note 3, Playing in the Dark, Lina Iris Victor. Next slide, please. A cosmology of the dark sublime, where there is no other, only variations of the one. Tenebrosity, from Latin, tenebrosus, or tenebrae, meaning darkness. What are the conditions of paradise? Enveloped by darkness, shrouded in blackness, she, they, multiplied, quietly amplified, her abode, a darkly lit sanctuary, where blackness emanates from the surface layers of her skin, a soothing, abstracting, extradermal blackness, a blackness alive with color, a blackness in constant transfiguration, effervescent radiation, permeating, percolating into the botanical microclimate below and transmuting solar micro and macrocosmos above, illuminated, punctuated, and ennobled by gold. Next slide, please. Her body is vessel, inseparable from the consumable darkness that surrounds her, wraps itself around her, bounds her, grounds her. Next slide, please. Birthing new mythologies, mothering blackness, she, a guardian of collective memories of histories untold, of putative feminitudes, embodied epistemologies, and insurgent ontologies. Lina Iris Victor, What Are the Conditions of Paradise? Next slide, please. Note 4, The Body Remembers, or A Disrupting Darkness, Hedda Ajipom. In a collection of essays written in 1991, Playing in the Dark, the late Toni Morrison writes about the racial other as a dark and abiding presence against which privileging and privilege differences are measured. And I quote, a disrupting darkness, both a visible and an invisible mediating force. How could it be otherwise? Morrison asks. Otherwise, both a proposition and a promise and a thread, imbued with fertile potentialities and indigenous knowledges, heterojipong, Black femininity as a disrupting darkness, in the present, in the archive, the embodiment of an imaginative riotous space, figurations of possible futures in which you, she, they, and we may break free momentarily from fixed identity-based categories, race, gender, class, and re-exist perhaps exquisitely and deliciously, to break free from perpetual micro and macro aggressions, fabrications, excavations, fabulations, accusations that restrain, refrain, and constrain, to reimagine oneself and our archival ancestors in a space not of oppression, but of beautiful disruptions and exquisite eruptions, the self as document, a radical space of individual and self-care that is collective, based on kinship and well-being, interlocuting, reimagining, enacting, performing, making visible, seeing, vision, your eyes defiant, different, probing, remediating. And yet, where may we rest? May we rest? Next slide, please. Note 5, if we care enough to look. And yet again, visibility is also dangerous and vulnerable, recognized by what we laud as both our deepest vulnerability and our greatest strength. In Ada Silvestri's Contagion, Color on the Frontline, which was commissioned by Autograph during the first national lockdown in Britain in March 2020, coronal splashes engulfed the photographic surface, palpably visualizing the devastating impact of the pandemic and the acute levels of exposure faced by frontline workers of color. Remote photographic portraiture and experimental action painting create a palpable sense of mutating viral disease or viral visual disarray that amplifies the very notion of contagion, calling our attention to inherent structural inequalities, societal disparities, institutional racisms, and other ongoing unfolding injustices, urging, inviting us to look carefully, to look with care, and importantly, in the artist's own words, to care enough to look. Previously, in Even This Will Pass and on Sterile Clinic, a visual vernacular of calculated abstraction calls upon our collective responsibility to protect from discerning, exposing gazes and judgments, suspended between proxy and portrait, telling the stories of those who have survived or arrived, mapping, suturing, and remediating. Next slide, please, their journey. Our journey began centuries ago. How do we cultivate care in our looking? How do we care? How do we watch and see with care? And how do we look responsibly? Rooted in fertile notions of ecofeminism, Monica de Miranda considers soil and rock and other elemental matter as porous, organic repositories of geological time, where ancestral and ecological traumas linked to colonial excavation continue to unfold on our bodies and lands. Monumental quarries symbolic of erosion and erasure, both in nature and in history, appear as potent mediations, and all that they hold towards regenerative possible futures. Next slide, please. Note 7, eyes that commit. Next slide, please. I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a sharp white background, Soren Hurston wrote in 1928. In the Black Horizon, do we muse on the sky or remember the past? Phoebe Boswell invites us to contemplate how we might practice freedom today, how we practice care, and how we do care work as practice, echoing and visually dialoguing with Christina Sharp in The Wake on Blackness and Being. It matters whose eyes are in front of and whose eyes are behind the camera, who looks, who watches, and who sees. It matters who cares, whose eyes inquire, whose hands paint, write, and cite. It matters too whose eyes create, control, and conserve, whose eyes commit, and whose generosity and curiosity enables us to think with, learn with, do with, to see differently. Last slide, please. To me, these artists' practices are birthed from the intimate spheres that prioritize the otherwise as an imaginative, remedial, generative for a force that sustains life, art, love, and breath. Their magical center is a gathering, a spell, an amorous acknowledgement, activation, and amplification of presences, acute visual commitment scripted in an affirmative grammar of generosity and potentiality that invites what I call remedial curatorial care. And that is a conversation for another time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renee. Deep, deep gratitude for these poetic visual notes that attest to your commitment to care and correspondence and to manifesting those spaces of the otherwise in your critical work and your curatorial work. Now it is my honor to introduce Akinbode Akinbiyi and Babajide Adeniyi Jones, or Uncle Bode and Uncle Jide, as they are well known to a generation of photographers, critics, curators, thinkers living and working across Lagos, the African continent, and throughout the African diaspora. Not only do their respective careers model the range of photographic practices that are possible during the 20th and 21st centuries, but their friendship is instructive in demonstrating that criticality and intellectual life can also be full of humor and joy. So with that, I'll leave it to Uncle Jide and Uncle Bode to bring us home in the spirit of conversation. Thank
you. Hello.
Hello, Babajide. Akinbode, please also unmute yourself.
Yeah, I've unmuted, yeah. Jide, you start off, huh?
Yes,
please.
I see my pictures have come up first, so I'll begin. To start with, I've really enjoyed the thoughtful contributions of the sort of academic thinkers who have been on this panel so far. Thank you, Roxana and Remy, very much.
From me too.
And you too.
No, I mean, my thanks to them.
I'm sort of, when I heard the title of this, I was, you know, I'm aware of the sort of postmodernist theories of decentering as a way of understanding the world. And so thinking of it in relation to the photographic image or document or record, and the way I work and the way that I try to guide, speak to a lot of young photographers who come my way, which is a lot of what I do a lot of the time these days. It's taken me on a sort of circular journey because my picture making, the image has never been the central, it's never been central in the sense that it existed independent of, you know, the context in which it's created. However, as the vehicle in which everything I want to say or would like to say is embedded, it becomes, the document becomes central and critical to everything. A lot of the people I speak to, I talk about how at the end of the day, all that we're left with is the image, is the document that you have created. Therefore, without making it precious, and but it's very important, to me, it's central to our production process, because that we know not everybody who sees your image will have you to explain it to. And so what I spend a lot of time talking to younger photographers about is being deliberate in how you present your image, in the creation of that document, being deliberate. And in that way, it sort of brought me back to realize that even though I've never seen the document as anything but a custodian of what I'm trying to say, it actually is central to everything I'm doing. So this first photograph was taken at the coronation of King Jaja of Opobo. Opobo being a city-state, was a city-state in the Niger Delta. And I made this photograph at the coronation of the king after they'd had a 20-year hiatus over a battle as to who was going to be the king. And so the document itself, a document of what happened that day, I could look at it as central to this image that I've made, a document of what happened. However, I look at everybody's faces. I looked at the way people are sort of looking with rapt attention at something that seems to be so fundamental to their lives. And then if we can look at the next slide. This is at Barack Obama's inauguration. And this is a way in which I find each one, which is specific document of something, and maybe central to that, but it's completely decentralized because the images themselves speak to a very small part of what the images together speak to. So can we go to the next picture? This is also in Opobo. This is young men playing pool by the water's edge. One of the things that I find important wherever I'm taking images is to look for the similarities that exist beyond these borders of whether nationality or religion or whatever. And so when I see situations that I've seen replicated all over the world, I've seen in a pool room in DC, I've seen, you know, people of this age, exactly the same body language. I think that once again, the image is a record of something, but it's not central to what I'm trying to say because it speaks to something far greater than these particular guys, wider than these particular guys on the beach. Next picture. This is an image that is, I think, speaks to sort of power relations, ideas of the guy in the foreground is working. He's selling things on the beach, but he represents something that you can see from the expressions in the background, and it's on a beach in the Caribbean. And so here you have the guy in the foreground who's eking out his daily bread within the milieu in which you have your windsurfers and extreme wealth. And like was mentioned earlier, these images are open to the interpretation of the viewer. Anybody who sees these images make of them what they know and understand. Next picture, please. Several years ago, I was living in Abuja, and I was doing a lot of work in the early days of the HIV epidemic in Nigeria. And I met these two ladies. And the lady facing the picture on the right had been a champion of the cause of people living with HIV, and she'd been leading lots of support groups. And the lady on the left joined her support group, and from a very low ebb was inspired to feel that actually I can live with this ailment. And she spoke about how she was an angel, and knowing her kept her alive. And then there was a period where the supply of antiretroviral drugs ran out. And then when it came back again, the lady on the right had developed a resistance to them. And so she began to get very ill. And so there was a reversal of roles. The person who had been so inspired by her became like her primary caregiver. At this time, there was a visit to Nigeria by Laura Bush. And the people in USAID asked if they could use this photograph in the presentations they were making to the First Lady of the United States, who at that time, the PEPFAR program was launched by George Bush. These were the most powerful people on the planet as far as helping people with HIV. And of course, I said, yes, they could use the image, and they took it and they had their session. And when I went to visit about a month later, the lady who's on the right had passed away. And it turned out about 2 or 3 days after the presentation, she had gone ill to a hospital. The hospital had refused to attend to her because she was an HIV patient. And days later, she passed away. And I thought that this, once again, was showing me the limits of the work we do, the limits of image production, because her image put before the most sort of powerful response was not able to help her. Can we go on to the next picture? This one is a very similar thing, but this is somebody who was emerging from a period of isolation after having lost her husband in the early days of the epidemic. And she was just beginning to feel she could face the world. So can we go on to the next image? This was done actually on an assignment for, I think, the Los Angeles Times, and it was about a lady who had been duped into a marriage and was left, was sort of abandoned by the duper, and also found it really difficult to cope with, to face the world after that. And what I thought was of interest in this image was that she had felt that being let down by marriage in the society that she lived in was the sort of the end of her life. But here she was with the henna on her hands, all the white dress, all of the things that go with marriage. She was being able to face life again. So we go into the next one. This is an image that I found that I had taken on the outskirts of Abuja many, many years ago. And it sort of seems to me to represent the simple values on the outskirts of the richest, most in the richest capital in West Africa. And these two young girls who go out selling groundnuts, and the photograph, the relationship, to me is much more than just a photograph of two girls. And then I think the last but one. This was taken in an IDP camp in Kenya, about a year after the post-election violence. And the photograph was taken on assignment where I was photographing people in the camp, and I was photographing what everybody expected, which was the devastation of the camp. But this image, which I felt was the image that would lead the story that I was doing, was one of hope, was one of in which you walk through a camp and you hear children laughing, and you see the structures that were first built to them, for them to live in, to provide basic shelter, is now repurposed to a climbing frame. And it's sort of is an image that that I think is reminiscent of the futility of violence against people, because another generation will come up and use can use the remnants of that as a climbing frame to. And then the last picture, I think. Oh no. This also is a photograph of, this is a village in the area that's now dominated by the people, the sort of Boko Haram uprising in Nigeria. This is in Borno State. And I thought it was an interesting image in that the girls walking out of frame, they represent two things that we're led to believe are incompatible. They're both children from the village, and they both, one of them is all covered in her, and the other one is from the different sort of religious groups that lived in perfect harmony in 2005. And then next. This is the last photograph, was two children going home after school. And we all know the importance at this age of the book bag that a child has after school. And here you have a piece of cellophane is her book bag. But interestingly, she has it tied up on her back, the way we carry babies in this part of the world, and sort of heading down into the unknown with her future securely tied upon her back in a country today where education has stifled the future of many young people. So with that, perhaps I'll hand over to Bode.
Thank you very much, Judea. And also, just in case Roxana and Remy, you didn't hear, thank you very, very much. And to all the panelists, I'm really very, very moved, very invigorated, and so many new ideas coming into me. So please, can you start off with my first image? Thank you very much. And you can see, hopefully that is in Berlin, taken in 2001. So my way of working is very much a wandering, constantly engaging with my environment, be it in the cities, which I'm usually in, I live in Berlin, or on the countryside. And this was at an exhibition opening, The Short Century in Berlin, by Okwi and Wezo, who is there at the pulpit talking. But behind him is an image, photograph, quite, what you call it, enlarged. And in it was the photograph of the Independence Day, October the 1st, 1960, in Lagos. And that was the first Prime Minister of Nigeria, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, and the representative of the Queen. This was Princess Alexandra of Kent, who came to give us our independence. So now, for me, this is very much, I felt, an image which questions this decentering the document. The document being the photograph in the photograph, but also, of course, Okwi in the image and the other onlookers and bystanders. And then the question becomes, for me, where is the center? What is being decentered? And what has happened since? This was 40 years later. And what has happened since Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was assassinated? I believe Princess Alexandra has since passed on. Okwuenwezor, unfortunately, too, has also passed on. And then even again, so many other aspects which really fascinate me. And something which I've been working on for decades is what actually is a photograph? What does it do? What does it document? and if for some, where is its center? Next image, please. Yeah. So now this is really what I call nitty-gritty work, because here now, this very important thing is very urgent, the photo, but where? Here. We have two arrows pointing in two different directions, people going by, a car, and a building in the background. And when I've exhibited this image or shown it in publications, many people can't fully, completely read it. Those in the know would realize that the urgent photo is actually the kind of advertisement saying that there's a photographer quite nearby, and he will take your photograph very quickly. Usually now in those days, you're already in those days digitally, print it out, and you can then go and use it for whatever needs you need, you need it for. In this particular area of Lagos, this was taken in where the embassies are. So then you often for your visa or for your passport. And yeah, one thing I'm very much interested in, again, this question of the photo itself. So is it really urgent in that respect? And where is here, where is there? What also interests me is the architectural formality in the background. And this was actually the living quarters for the law students in Lagos at that time. The next image, please. So now this really comes again much more even to the nitty-gritty of it, because this was a more recent image. And this is one thing I've been really working on are the photo booths and photo automats and photo places. In many cities all over the world, and wherever I see them, I try to make photographs. This particular one I really work on a lot because it's often being deconstructed, so to speak. Like you can see, there's this curtain which is supposed to enclose you within this kind of cubicle has been torn. And from time to time, people actually take drugs inside that place or just sit there because it's an underground station. And then you can see the graffiti as well. And it's supposed to be actually these particular photo booths, like you can actually use them for your passports, so your passport and so on. And I've really been working on these things. Recently, I photographed one where there was even all kinds of stuff on the ground. It was just really crazy. And then just a few days ago, again, another one, and there was another kind of chair again, but a bit different. So I'm constantly working on these images. And I really like what Anton was saying about the bookshop in Harlem. Yeah, it was in New York, rather, sorry, not in Harlem, in New York, but it was in Harlem. Because like Barbosa, I keep on going back and photographing and keep on photographing and trying to get really to the very essence of what it is I'm trying to look for, what it is I'm trying to find, what it is I'm trying to see. And in this particular case, questioning all the time, yeah, what is a photograph? What is it supposed to be? What is it supposed to do? What is happening a lot now, a lot of these, not these particular ones, but other photo booths and photo automats are being used for to make kind of selfies, but not selfies from your own mobile phone, but in the photo booth itself. Sometimes you get 4, 5, 6 people who cram themselves inside there, sometimes even with their dogs or their pets. And the other day, I even saw some children playing inside there. It was very nice, actually. Yeah. So now I'll come to my final image. Thank you very much. So this, again, part of my work on the what is a photograph? What is it trying to do? And this was taken some years ago in Bamako. And again, very interesting for me, some people read this as studio to go, because that term to go is being used nowadays for people who in the morning especially buy their coffee or their sandwiches on the go, to go. But this is actually a studio, and it was Togo. And actually the photographer who came out, because he saw me photographing, was from Togo. And we got into quite a interesting conversation. And then you see the what I really love in this particular image are the people looking back. They were actually looking back at a wedding, which was taking part of to the right. And then also the photograph depicted on the wall of the studio, photographing again, making portraits. So now, yeah, the whole thing is for me a very much a fragment of movement, especially the donkey going by, and what you can call it donkey power, horsepower. But the man being who has been having his portrait taken, sitting down, and again the photo minute. So much happening here. For me, ties into my quest, my research on what really is a photograph, where is the center or decentering it, the document, all these kind of things. I think I've said enough. Thank you. Once again, I want to say really a big thank you, heartfelt thank you for the whole wonderful evening.
What a remarkable co-presentation and journey across images. I was just reading two polycyclic photographic, everything for the photographic cycle. It was written in that last image of the studio in Bamako. Our wholehearted thanks, Babajide and Akinbode. As right a second ago, the president of the Museum of Modern Art, Ronnie Hyman, just emailed me to say that she enjoyed immensely the presentations, which were indeed fantastic, and we could not agree more with her. It is, in fact, with an ampler, richer, more complex reassessment of the idea of the photographic document that this convening has reached now its conclusion of its time. And I will end with words of gratitude for the generous and brilliant contributions of each one of the presenters. It would be such a great pleasure for me and us all at MoMA to welcome you anytime at the museum. And we hope you will be able to see the exhibition New Photography 2023 and experience it in person, experience, in fact, the work of the extraordinary 7 photographers that are being brought together by Remy, and this edition focused on Lagos. So with admiration for the artists and the presenters, Remy and I would like to profusely thank everyone gathered today, and also hats off to our audiovisual team, Jeffrey, Zachary, Mark, and our formidable colleagues in the photography department, Megan Feingold and Marion Tonde, for their invaluable collaboration on this forum. Thank you all so very much for joining us. Happy spring and summer and beyond.